Greetings, classist, and welcome to the first lesson back after Christmas. I hope you are all happy and rested and have put on a bit of weight, and Santa brought everything that your little hearts desired for Christmas. Anyway, one final Christmas present for you, and that is some 10-mark questions on invention of the barbarian. So let's get started. Now, we've looked at a lot of these images that show the Greeks fighting Amazons. We've got the frieze at Bassae, we've got the Euphronius painter, we've got the Penthesilea painter, we've got the picture of Hercules fighting against, I think that's the Euphronius one, fighting against the Amazons in the Attic War. So you've got an understanding of these images, and we've also talked about this kind of framework of analysis. And we will go through it again because these are some really important things to look out for. But having said all that, you need to be very careful about the question. These will be 5 really important key areas for what I would imagine most questions will cover. But you have to be flexible. You have to think on your feet. You have to have the knowledge and the confidence to do it. So anyway, let's go through these again very briefly. So first of all, in no particular order, nudity. What does the depiction of nudity tell you about someone in one of these images? Well, if it's a man, it's almost certainly heroic nudity. And heroic nudity points to manliness, andreia, strength, discipline, favour from the gods. And if you focus in on the genitalia, that came out wrong, but you know what I mean. So often you will see that they are small genitalia, hinting at restraint and control and balance, the value of sophrosune, which we shall look at a little bit later on. So for men, nudity is almost always a good thing. It is a sign of control, restraint, discipline, strength, masculine order, and favour of the gods. Nudity for women is pretty much the opposite, because women shouldn't be nude in public. Now, we do have the slight exception of the Spartans, but we'll put them to one side for the time being. So nudity in women, and that doesn't necessarily mean full nudity. That can mean an inappropriate showing of body parts. So what you'll often see in these plots would be things like, naked legs or arms, which for most Greek women would be covered up if they were outside. There is a little bit of nudity. So some images, Bassae especially, you do see Amazon warriors with exposed breasts, which would be absolutely controversial. So nudity in women, be it partial or complete, tends to point to inappropriate sexuality, softness, perhaps a kind of inappropriateness for the battlefield. And we'll come on to that when we look at sort of clothing and weapons and armour as well. So nudity is very different depending on who is being depicted as nude and the way in which they're being depicted nude. So the next thing that we need to think about is clothing. Now, what does clothing tell you about the individuals? And now, for a lot of the female figures, the way that they're clothed, again, can be quite revealing. So you can kind of link it with nudity in that, if someone's wearing a very short dress or tunic, that in itself is a kind of highlighting of their sensuality, their inappropriate sexuality. But often the women will be wearing soft clothes, so clothes that emphasised softness and luxury, which again the Greeks considered to be a bit of a weakness, especially on the battlefield. Clothing could also show excessive patterning, so these crazy barbaric designs of zigzags and checks and dots and all these sorts of things that show a descent into kind of luxury and decadence and things that are perhaps too ornate and luxurious for the battlefield. Clothing could also be the ultimate in femininity or effeminacy, depending on who's wearing it. The trousers. Remember, for the Greeks, this is a real sign of softness and luxury, especially in warfare. And trousers are very commonly associated with Persians, the most dangerous and decadent of Eastern barbarians. So do think about what type of clothing they're wearing. Is it soft? Is it luxurious? But also think about whether it's gender appropriate, because someone might, a woman, for example, wearing, proper armor and a proper leather skirt and proper greaves, which are the shin guards, they may all actually be very, very Greek. But the inappropriateness there is the fact that it's a woman wearing them, not inherent within the garment itself. So give that some thought. Now, the next thing you need to look at is weapons and what they signify. Weapons and armor. So remember, if they have got a long spear, the dory, and the big hoplon shield, that is the equipment of the hoplite fighter. And hoplites fight in this formation called the phalanx. And the hoplite and the phalanx is really quite a political idea as well as a military one. To fight in this formation, you have to be a citizen, you have to be disciplined, you have to be organized. There has to be a degree of equality, although we need to be very careful about how we use that word. So just the sign of the dory, the spear, and the hoplon, the shield, will transmit a lot of that information, even though it's not being transmitted by the actions of an individual in in the image itself. So I'm trying to think of a good example, but I guess it's a good example, but it's a bit of a weird one, I suppose. If you saw a fireman climbing a tree to rescue a sweet little kitten, then you saw on his neck, I don't know, I'm pointing at my neck, but you saw on his neck a sort of tattoo of a swastika. Even though that's a fireman, public servant doing a good thing, rescuing a kitten, just that little symbol, has a huge wealth and power and suggestion of evil, even though he is not doing anything evil at the time and not doing anything particularly Nazi-like at the time. So you can view the hoplon, the shield, or the dory as almost having that kind of level of impact in terms of symbolism. So tied in with that, you've got armor as well. And remember, there's a little bit of a conflict, if you like, in that if a man is naked, that is focusing more on their heroic nudity, and that doesn't necessarily mean they are not supposed to be thought of as hoplite fighters. But in a lot of images, you will see, often secondary to the main event, especially if they're men, you'll see people wearing arms and armor. So this is the armor that's very necessary for the up close and personal fighting of the hoplite phalanx, not the running around and fighting from a distance of the Persians, of the barbarians, who you'll often see with bows and arrows and soft clothing rather than armor. And again, that's really important as a way of identifying you and your life values. So if someone has got full-on suit of armor and they've got a hoplon and they've got a dory, they're not going to be running around too much. They're going to be fighting by very nature in this disciplined formation that requires manliness. But then when you see the Amazons doing the same thing, that's why it's so shocking, because they've co-opted these kind of masculine ideas and characteristics. Next thing to look out for is body position and motion. So what does the body position tell you? Is one individual submissive? Is one individual dominant? So often you will see men dominating women on the battlefield. So that is a sort of sign of the kind of inherent victory of manliness and masculinity. Or is there a bit of fear and terror introduced by women standing up to men? So again, you go back to the Euphronius painter, I think it is, when you've got the Amazon hoplites in phalanx formation who show absolutely no sign of running away from Hercules. So again, sometimes, so a sort of victorious stance can show one thing, and an equal stance can show another. Other things to think about, of course, in this idea of stance are motion. So famously, Penthesilea running away, or Amazons perhaps moving forward to engage with an individual. So in some of the pictures, especially on Bassae, you'll see cloaks billowing out behind people, which give almost that kind of cartoonish impression of charging forward, which can in itself show bravery or rashness, or perhaps fury and passion, depending on how you want to look at it. Now, the next thing, which is a vast thing, is of course context. So, you know, who, and this can be almost anything really, this is a bit of a catch-all term, you know, who is in the image? Is it Achilles and Penthesilea? If so, why is that so important? Well, you've got Achilles, the greatest Greek hero, being, you know, and Penthesilea, you know, this great Amazon queen, fighting him. So you've kind of got almost the best of the Greek world versus the best and most dangerous of the barbaric world. You know, who is the fact, again, you know, when you've got Hercules fighting the Amazons, you know, you've got these Amazons who are so powerful, so strong, so terrifying that they're taking on, you know, a demigod. Context is also, you know, things like appropriate gender roles. So, you know, should women be on the battlefield? Well, you know, according to the Greeks, you know, absolutely not. Other things that we'll see are certain gestures with great meaning. So the gesture of supplication, often you'll see Penthesilea doing this, where she's reaching her hand up and appealing to mercy from Achilles. So all of these things sort of feed into our kind of understanding of the images. Other important context is, of course, the, you know, the Persian Wars and the impact that would have had on Greek depictions of barbarians and so on and so forth. So again, a run through of the sort of things that you could and should be looking for, but again, think on your feet. Things may be depicted. The question may mean that this sort of formula of 5 or 6 things doesn't work perfectly, so you have to think on your feet and answer the question. So let's have a look at this pot. We've looked at it before, but I don't think we've looked at this one in particular depth, so we're going to do that right now. So we've got a scene of Achilles and Penthesilea by the Penthesilea painter, and it was done in 460-ish BC. So what we immediately realise there is this was done after the main battles in the war between the Greeks and the Persians. So the Greeks have experienced the fear and terror of Persian invasion. They've experienced the sort of victory and joy of driving them off. And I think we can probably see that reflected in the pot, perhaps. So let's start with our sort of framework of analysis. And what I'd like to do is to label the image. You've had it, I've given it to you a couple of times. So label the image with the appropriate labels of analysis. So let's have a think about nudity. So looking straight away, we can see that the main character, who is Achilles, is nude. And again, we realise that that is heroic nudity, pointing out his discipline, his heroic, almost semi-divine status. And again, we can see from his small genitalia that, you know, he is in control of his sex and sexuality. Although, again, don't be afraid to at least consider some counter arguments. You know, Achilles is famous in some versions of the story for falling in love with Penthesilea. So do we see that here? Do we see the kind of stirrings of love, if you like, from Achilles as he plunges his sword into Penthesilea's breast? Possibly, but I think by and large the depiction is that of order and control. When it comes to other nudity, we can see with Penthesilea that she's exposed her legs and her arms and her face. So whilst to us this might not appear particularly shocking, that she's showing an awful lot of flesh for a Greek woman in public. So there is certainly a sexual or sensual element to Penthesilea there. although we wouldn't necessarily recognize it from our own kind of cultural perspective. So yes, again, clothing is showing that kind of inappropriate, also nudity is showing, or hinting at least, that kind of inappropriate sexuality. So on to clothing, and here we've got a lot to deal with, and we'll go straight to the Amazon figure who is lying on the floor, who is dead or dying, who is not Penthesilea. And this is quite an important one because we can see straight away there's a lot to dive into. So first of all, she seems to be wearing trousers, that ultimate sign of barbarity and softness and luxury. So not something that should be worn on the battlefield. Now the trousers, and especially the way the trousers are patterned, that kind of zigzag pattern, really reminds the Greeks of the Persians. So the trousers and these zigzag pattern trousers are what Persians and often Persian archers would have worn. So this is the dress of the enemy, of the barbarian, and this is not something that Amazons were necessarily famous for wearing before the Persian Wars. You think back to the Hercules versus the Amazons plot, and we see them wearing sort of the jumpsuit and trousers, but the majority of them are in that kind of interestingly hoplite formation. We go, so anyway, we also see not only is she wearing trousers and this sort of patterned sort of bodysuit or onesie, going all the way up her arms, she's wearing this sort of soft, luxurious, flimsy kind of sort of tunic over the top, which again is not really appropriate for a battlefield. It's quite strangely soft and decadent. So the Amazon on the floor's clothes are telling you, they're hinting at Persian men, but they're also hinting at sort of softness and femininity and luxury, but in a very inappropriate location. We then turn to the other side of the pot where we've got the Greek man who I don't think we necessarily know who he is. He may not be a particular hero. He is wearing a cloak, but I don't think that's excessive. I don't think that's too much luxury. Spartans were famous for the red cloaks that they had. But what he is wearing is what's called a linothorax, a suit of armor and an appropriate kind of tunic or skirt to go with it. So this is, we're kind of drifting into armor now, but again, this is the arms and armor of a hoplite fighter, someone who is a citizen, who fights for their city, who works together, who shows order, discipline, restraint, and Greekness. And the arms and armor and the way you fight is a really big differentiator between Greeks and Persians, and you'll really see that once we've read Herodotus and had a look at what he has to say about it. So moving on, we've got the there's a couple of other things that I would just draw your attention to. So Penthesilea seems to be wearing a kind of quite feminine headband and earrings, again, which I think point to her kind of a very feminine nature. And I think it's quite interesting, the dress that Penthesilea is wearing, which is the chiton, C-H-I-T-O-N. This is a very famous Greek dress that women would wear, and they would often wear something over the top if they were ever heading out. So even though she's a barbarian, she's wearing very, very Greek clothing. But again, perhaps the shock is the inappropriateness. It's on the battlefield. It's out of the house. And I think it's quite interesting overall, the impact this has, because she's not a wild, savage, barbaric woman who's being kind of rightly put in her place by Achilles. She looks absolutely Greek. She has sort of Greek style earrings and headband and dress. She's wearing sort of ankle bracelets. All of these things are common Greek female jewelry. So it's quite an interesting image. You know, Achilles is brutally stabbing to death a very Greek-looking woman, and it's also quite interesting to note that none of the Amazons actually have weapons. Now, one would assume they've been dropped or discarded or you know, thrown away. I don't think Achilles is necessarily killing unarmed Amazons, but I don't know. You know, it's not, the artist has certainly not chosen to show it as a conflict. He's seemingly showing it as a bit more of an execution. And again, compare that to Hercules fighting the Amazons, where they're going absolutely toe to toe. Here, it's less of a contest, and is that sort of a celebration of the victory of sort of masculinity over wild femininity, or are we supposed to feel some kind of sympathy for Penthesilea? Up to you. That's how art works. So on to weapons, which we've talked about a bit, but as you'll see, Achilles has got a sword, and the other Greek has got a sword and the dory, the spear. And these are very, very Greek masculine weapons. The spear is used first as part of the hoplite, and then when the spear breaks, out comes the swords, because they are a lot more fragile than we would understand modern swords to be. So the fact that these two Greek warriors are down to their swords suggests that they've been in pretty heavy fighting. Their spears have broken, and you know, it's been a long slog. It's been a tough day. This is real hand-to-hand work. So that's what those swords are telling you, that things have broken down into a brutal kind of hand-to-hand combat. But the dory spear that the guy on the side has got is reminding you that they're hoplite fighters and all that goes with it. And that's interesting, because Achilles is not a hoplite fighter. He's very individualistic, but that's not how he's being. That's not the kind of message that we're being sent by the arms and armor of the pod. We've already talked about armor, so we'll go on to stance. So if you look at, again, the Amazon lying defeated and dead on the floor, you know, perhaps she's been killed by Achilles, perhaps she's been killed by the other guy. You know, we've got this image of, you know, of defeat. You know, she is most likely dead. Perhaps she's lying there wounded. You know, her eyes are open, and it's quite unusual. There's a sort of front-on facial depiction, which is quite rare. But I think one thing to remember about this is that is the nature of the pot itself. It's a kylix, and so this is the inside of a drinking pot, and it would have probably had red wine in it. And as you drunk, you're sort of looking down into the drinking pot. It's almost like a bowl. Well, it is a bowl, basically. And as you drink, you turn, and you would see this Amazon come rising out of this kind of sloshing red blood, and you'd see Penthesilea come rising out of this sloshing red blood. So it would have been quite a gory and graphic scene of kind of blood and slaughter. So anyway, we've got the very much defeated, probably dead Amazon on one side, and then when we move back to Penthesilea's stance, we've got a stance of submission. She's sort of falling down to the ground. Unsurprisingly, she's being stabbed in the heart by Achilles. Achilles is kind of leaning over her in a very kind of dominant, controlling, powerful stance. There's no real suggestion of conflict here, is there? You know, unlike other pots, you know, the Amazons have been absolutely crushed, effortlessly, perhaps. Well, maybe in this moment in time. You've got the Greek, you know, the other Greek man who, again, there appears to be a bit of kind of movement to him. You know, he's active. He's running around the battlefield. Doesn't seem to be running away particularly. So the other thing that is certainly worth pointing out is Penthesilea's gesture. Now, what Penthesilea is doing here is lifting her hand up in a gesture of supplication. So she's begging Achilles for mercy. And This is again an interesting sort of point. It shows that she's civilized to a degree. It shows that she understands some of the customs and norms of the Greek world. And, you know, Achilles does brutally kill her when she's begging for mercy. So there's certainly some questions to be asked about that. I would, and to us, it just seems obviously wrong. You know, she's begging for mercy, she's weak, she's helpless. Achilles shouldn't kill her. And plenty of Greeks would have agreed with you, because that's showing a lack of kind of restraint. On the other hand, there's no obligation to spare someone who's begging for mercy. You know, it's not a kind of legal requirement, if you like, and Achilles absolutely executes men as well, who have surrendered and tried to clasp his knees, as do other heroes. It's not, you know, it's a little bit of a grey area for Achilles, and it's certainly worth pointing out. So moving on to context, obviously we've got this idea of the war at Troy, the kind of defining conflict of what it means to be Greek. You know, one of the things that makes you a Greek is that your ancestors fought at Troy and that you understand the story of Troy. You have the Greeks on one side, and on the other side you have the Trojans, the Easterners, the strange barbarians like the Ethiopians, the Pygmies, and the Amazons. Other context to consider is, you know, the fact that this, as we talked about before, the fact that, you know, Penthesilea, you know, is fighting, or at least has fought, Achilles, this greatest of Greek heroes, although in this particular depiction he seems to have overcome her relatively easily. So those are some of the key things to look out for in this Achilles and Penthesilea plot. So just a few keywords to remind you of. So chiton was the dress that Penthesilea was wearing, and it is a very Greek dress, although worn by both men and women, although not worn by itself by women outside. Hoplon is the shield, the big shield that gives rise to the name hoplite, the individual who fights in the phalanx formation. The dory is the spear that's used by the hoplite. The Attic helmet is the helmet that Achilles and the other man are using, which again is a helmet for hoplite warriors. And Andrea is manliness, that kind of value or virtue of manliness. So what I'd like you to do now is pause the video and be strict, because this has to be handed in today. So no, this is all got to be done in the lesson time and handed in with this assignment before the next lesson. So 15 minutes only to answer this question: to what extent does the image, and that's the previous image, show the difference between Greeks and barbarians? So 15 minutes, obviously if you get extra time, work it out. So what's 25% of 15 minutes? Do it on your calculators. And again, we need 7 to 8 points that answer the question. And I would certainly consider a little bit of balance perhaps in this one. Not a huge amount, because I think it fundamentally is showing a lot of differences between Greeks and barbarians. But is there just one area where you can say perhaps there's a little bit of a similarity, just to show that you understand the to what extent part of the question? Anyway, over to you. 15 minutes, write it, go. Good, I'm sure that was amazing. I look forward to reading them. Okay, so just for reference, this is the Hercules and the Amazons pot that I was talking about before with the Euphronius painter. So we can see a slightly different depiction. There are some similarities. We've got two Amazons dressed as Persian warriors in sort of trousery jumpsuits, firing bows and arrows. So real kind of Persian Easterner, sneaky, quite weak or unmanly behaviour. But then interestingly, we have got Amazon women in a hoplite formation, as hoplites in a phalanx, fighting Hercules, one of the great Greek heroes. So just a point of reference, we've talked through this one before. What I'd like to do with this one is another 15-mark question. To what extent does this image highlight the threat the Amazons posed to Greek society? And that is another 10-marker. So you've got 15 minutes, 7 to 8 points, and in this one I think you need to understand the context. So this is the Attic War, and obviously the figure in the middle is Hercules or Heracles. So what does that mean? How does that contribute to our understanding of the question? So stop. You've got 15 minutes. Off you go. Okay, so on to our next image, and this is that of Bassae, a frieze at Bassae. And I am not going to tell you anything about this one because I'm going to show you what an exam question might look like. So that would be your image, and then you would have 3 questions like this, obviously more afterwards. You'd have a couple of 1-mark questions. So who is the male figure in the image? You need to tell me. What building was the frieze taken from? Then you get your 10-mark question. How effectively does this image depict important beliefs the Greeks had about their society? Well, there you go. That is the final task. Another 10-mark question. So you've got another 15 minutes to do it, and no help from me on this one. So by the end of this lesson, you should submit 3 10-mark questions, and you should have spent no longer than 15 minutes doing each one. So 3 10-mark questions should take you 45 minutes, and then this PowerPoint should take you half an hour, a little bit more, and allowing for time to stop and jot down some of the things I said, that's an hour and a half. So this is a normal lesson length. So if you're taking longer than an hour and a half to do this one, you're taking too long on various activities. So there we go, a brutal but powerful introduction to classics in the new year. Well done, and I shall see you in the next lesson, which will have a live component. But one thing which I want to make crystal clear, you need to hand this work in. Nobody should be giving me any excuses as to why this cannot be done. Even if you do 3 and they're an absolute shit show, it doesn't matter. You need to get into the habit of having a go and then improving. Good. Okay, well, good luck, and I will see you in the next lesson.